My dad left for work one day, said goodbye to me, said goodbye to my mum, went off to work. And when he returned, me, my mum, and all of our furniture was gone from the house. We just disappeared.
So, hi, Ben, and welcome to the Anti-Alienation Project. I'm so glad to have you here. I've been really looking forward to talking to you and talking about your book. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
That is a really big accomplishment. But before we talk about your book, I would love to get into your personal story if we can. And I know many people watching will be curious to hear more about what it was like for you as an alienated
Mm,
child, what it was like for you to grow up and then eventually learn the truth,
mm,
the aftermath of that. Um,
mm,
but I want to start with the very first sentence of your book, which happens to be called Your Journey in the preface. Where
mm,
the first line, as someone who's been through this too,
mm,
I read the first line and it's just, there's so much weight in there. You say,
mm,
"My father describes the day I was born as one of the happiest days of his life."
mm,
I can't imagine the emotion that you would feel
mm,
just writing that and knowing that.
mm.
So I was curious, what was life like for you, and what was your relationship with your dad like before the alienation was solidified?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, so thank you so much for having me on. I'm always happy to talk about this topic because, as you'll hear in a second, it's something that's very close to me personally, but also a big part of the work that I now do. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the work that I do brought me to understanding my own experience rather than the other way around. So it wasn't a it wasn't a kind of organic thing where I realized that I'd been alienated and therefore I made it my life's work. I kind of found my way to it accidentally, professionally, and then it served as a revelation for me that I've now decided to kind of continue and look at in more detail. Um, so the kind of understanding and the timeline and all of the stuff I'm going to talk about is really the product of only kind of the last 3 years of the professional work unlocking the personal work that I've been doing. And so I guess when I talk about it, I can also talk about what I used to think and what I now know, because of the conversations that I've been able to have, principally with my dad, to kind of set the record straight in his eyes. Um, but yeah, I mean, from the conversations that I've had with him and the few photographs that we have of that time, my parents met in 1988. They fell in love very quickly. They'd both come out of long-term relationships. They got married a year later. Were very, very happy. They fell pregnant with me. And yeah, I was born in 1989. And yeah, my dad says, he felt like any new father would. He was, ecstatic, and he was relieved that I'd arrived, and because my entry was quite traumatic. So I think, it's actually a lot of the emotions that I felt when my kids were born, as a father. And then, we had a very close relationship by all accounts. Obviously I was a baby, so I don't remember it directly, but my dad describes it very, affectionately. He says that he was a very hands-on dad, and he had to be, because about a year into my life, there was a secret multiple sclerosis diagnosis that was revealed. So my mother had actually been diagnosed with MS when she was 16, but my maternal grandparents kept that information from her. So she didn't know, my dad didn't know when they got married. And obviously she didn't know until she went to the doctor without her parents for the first time, which was when I was about one, because she was having symptoms. And they said, "Oh, that'll be the MS." And they were like, "What MS?" So, because of that, he was very hands-on dad. And yeah, as far as I'm aware, we were very, very close.
I know your grandparents from your preface played a big part in your
Yeah.
alienation. So
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
keeping such a life-changing
Yeah.
diagnosis away from their teenage daughter. Did they give a reason why they would?
They originally said because she was 16, they didn't want to disrupt her exams, and then she went into remission because she had a type of MS. There are different types. She had a type where you could have an episode and then go into remission, and then the next episode would be worse, and so on and so forth. So they kind of willfully ignored it and let it rumble on. And I mean, I don't agree with what they did. I'm just saying this was their rationale. Um, but when that diagnosis came out, that threw, a lot of information into the mix. It put a lot of strain on the relationship. And that was really when those grandparents, my maternal grandparents, really ramped up in terms of their involvement with the relationship, the pressure, the kind of almost kind of coercive controlling behaviors towards my dad. They were very keen for my dad to, for example, give up work and become a full-time carer for my mum. And my mum also didn't react well to the news because at that time we didn't know a lot about MS, so she didn't know what the future held. She was very scared, and she, as a consequence, she withdrew, and that placed a lot of strain on the relationship as well. So yeah, there was a lot of pressure over the first kind of 4 years of my life that kind of had an influence on the relationship. But in terms of my dad's relationship with me, we were very, very close, and probably more close than lots of dads and sons, because of the care that he had to give to me, because my mum was unable to. Um, and also, by all accounts, I was quite a challenging child as well. So he had his hands full. But yeah, he was no deadbeat dad, that's for sure.
How old were you when your mom discovered the truth about her diagnosis?
So I was around one.
You were one. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. And what age were you when the alienation began?
So I was four, and my parents' relationship had been deteriorating, but they hadn't sat down and said, this is what's going to happen, or we need a divorce, etc. And my dad, it was a very abrupt beginning to the alienation. My dad left for work one day, said goodbye to me, said goodbye to my mum, went off to work, and when he returned, um, me, my mum, and all of our furniture was gone from the house. We just disappeared in our entirety. And unbeknownst to my dad, who just returned and was completely confused and shocked, I had been taken to my maternal grandparents' house. And they had left him a note saying, you're not needed anymore. You don't deserve to be a part of Ben and Joanne, my mum's life. But here's where you can send the money to help care for him. Don't worry about getting in contact. So the alienation began quite abruptly and severely, with a kind of, I don't like using this term because it sounds very harsh, but academically speaking, an abduction. And then there was about a month period where my dad didn't see me, because of the contact was being withheld. And then there was a 2-year out of court period and a 2-year in court period, so 4 years overall, where there was a process to try and determine parenting responsibilities, where my dad was trying to fight for more time with me. And across that whole period, there were the behaviors. So lots of things that we now know with our measures that we now have, etc., that representative of alienating behaviors. So, limiting contact, controlling contact, denigration, etc., loyalty conflict, a binary view of the parents, etc. So it was a 4-year period between when I was 4 and 8 years old, when the relationship with my dad was kind of consistently attacked and undermined. And I would see him every other weekend. And that was an informal arrangement at first, and then a formalized court arrangement whilst custody was being determined. And I think that, if anything, is what at least gave us a fighting chance, because even though there would be this process of alienation for 12 days, I would then get 2 days with him where anything that they said would obviously be undermined, because I would be like, this guy, yeah, this guy seems all right, you know. So yeah, it was a 4 year kind of long period of that type of thing.
Wow. Okay. So I'm glad that you said abduction because in my head I was thinking, okay, that sounds more like abduction.
Yeah.
Um, going back to that day when you were 4 years old and things changed all of a sudden, do you remember that anything about that happening? No.
No, I have a lot of well, rather, I have very few memories from pre-10, and I think a lot of that is probably because of just everything that was happening, and it was overwhelming. And I think my hypothalamus just shut down at that time and was like, I'm not coding any memories. Yeah, I don't really have a lot of memories of a lot of that time. But I remember when it ended. I remember when I transferred residency. But yeah, other than that, not a lot. But I remember distinct things about the alienation and some of the things that would happen. So, for example, there was an incident where my dad came to pick me up, and it was when he was now with his new partner, my stepmom. Um, and my mother's brother, my uncle, was just completely enraged that he had brought his new partner along, and he marched outside and he pinned my dad up against the car and was like threatening to like kill him, etc. And I actually saw that through the window, and I was watching, and both me and my dad kind of recall that incident as being a kind of really key thing that happened, and I can replay it very visually. Um, and there were just lots of other things that I kind of unconsciously or subconsciously remember about being made to feel very guilty about going away from my mum because she was ill and she needed me, and my dad didn't, so I should stay there. And I remember a lot of being asked where I wanted to live by social workers and stuff. So you know yeah, I think it's interesting because some people would say, well, how do you know you're alienated if you can't remember any of it? And I think, first of all, I can remember some distinct things, but a lot of it is more of a feeling that you're given about a person. So you don't have to remember the specific acts, but you remember how you feel. And I remember feeling kind of just weird and off about going and spending time with my dad and him as a person. Um, through no actions that because what I don't have is any memories of my dad being an aggressor, or being a horrible person. If anything, whenever I went to stay, those weekends would be an extravaganza every fortnight, because my dad would be playing catch up. He would want to do this with me, this with me, this with me. And I actually have very fond memories from that time with my dad that sit against the feeling that I had at the time. So it's that kind of evidence before your eyes versus what the narrative you're being fed. Because what I do remember, for example, is I used to go with my dad on Sunday mornings to get a McDonald's breakfast,
Yeah.
which is funny because taking your kids to McDonald's has actually been something that is cast as like a really deadbeat dad thing to do. But they're some of the happiest memories I have of that time, are with him and doing that and just sitting and having, a styrofoam plate with, all this stuff on. So yeah, it's a very funny thing, alienating behaviors, I think, in terms of how they make you feel rather than what is actually being done.
Absolutely. I thank you for saying all of that. It's something hard to describe to other people.
Mm,
Um, in those moments with your dad, say, for example, at McDonald's or when you went with him,
mm, mm.
you remember like what you felt like in your body or what your thoughts were like
Well,
during those
I,
times?
I remember how I didn't feel, and I never felt unsafe or unloved, which was weird because it sat against this kind of picture that was being painted of him, to me, as someone who didn't care about me,
Mhm.
didn't care about my mum. That was a big thing, that he'd abandoned my mum when she was ill, which was not the case. But actually, that is something that I did carry for a long time, is this kind of residual feeling that that's why the relationship broke down, because that's the narrative I was fed, was that basically my mum got ill, things got too tough, and my dad bailed, which is just such an oversimplification of what actually happened. For me, a lot of the effect actually came after the court case was settled, because of the residual trauma. But I will come on to that in a minute. But very interesting, tumultuous time. And I mean, the way my dad talks about it, obviously as the alienated or the targeted parent, I mean, it was the worst time of his life, of course. First of all, he's not seeing me as much as he wants to. So there's the contact issue, but it's more about the relationship and the fact that, I was being told a certain version of him and fed a certain version of him alongside the emotional and financial turmoil of a court case. So yeah, he still carries a huge amount of trauma from that time,
I
for
can't
sure.
even imagine the level of
Yeah.
trauma for both of you. I'm really sorry. It's terrible.
Mm,
Um, do you remember any specific lies you were made to believe, or what exactly about your dad you were
mm.
manipulated into, um, or forced into believing?
It was mainly that he was uncaring and
Okay.
that he was neglectful. And I mean, they could they couldn't spin any abusive lies about my dad, because my dad is not an abuse. He's the most docile person. So I just think it wouldn't have tracked. But they really put the emphasis on this neglect, that he didn't care for me, that he didn't, and specifically around my mum, where she was ill, and they really emphasized this picture and this painting of my mum being this ill, vulnerable person that my dad abandoned. And because obviously, everyone loves their mother, and I love my mother very much, that was a way of saying, it was kind of attacking him by manipulating the love that I had for my mum, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Because they were basically saying, this person that you love so much, this other person really screwed them over, so you shouldn't like that person.
Yeah.
So I think that was the main thing that they really focused on doing. And then the other stuff, it was more about just disrupting the time that we would spend together. So, for example, my dad loves sports. He loves all sports. He's a very sporty person, used to be a very sporty person. Um, and I was always very uh, kind of pushed away from sports. Like, I was never actively encouraged to engage in sports. I wasn't signed up for any clubs or anything like that, specifically because it would then mean that I wouldn't have that bond with my dad. So it can sometimes be really seemingly insidious behaviors and really kind of low level behaviors, but they're actually really, really impactful, because that's actually something that I still feel a disconnect with him to till this day. So people might say, oh, it's probably just they didn't have time to sign you up and all this kind of thing. It's like, no, it was a targeted thing.
Yeah.
And it was done with a very purposeful intent, because they knew how much dad loved it. And so I now have been robbed for decades of the opportunity to, yeah, go to football matches or sit and watch. We actually had a really healing moment just last night, because we sat and watched the England South Africa rugby game together.
Yeah.
Um, Although we lost, so that wasn't great. But it was still a moment that actually we haven't actually done that much before. Um, so yeah, it's interesting how long these things can last as well.
Yes. I'd venture to say a lifetime, not to say that
Yeah,
you can't
yeah.
heal, but I
No,
think
but
scars
you
are
know,
permanent. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Um, so during the alienation process, and when you were alienated, do you remember the impact that had on you emotionally, mentally, or socially, anything like that?
I yeah, I mean, it was the thing is I think at the time, so there's two distinct periods that I kind of associate with it. So there's the custody battle, which is when I was 4 till 8, and then the aftermath, which was between when I was 8 and 18.
Mhm.
And they both had a very different impact. So at the time, because I mean, 4 till 8, that those are some formative years.
Yeah.
Any child developmental psychologist, such as myself, will tell you those are really formative years. And I think the pressure and the things like the loyalty conflict and all of that stuff that was bred then, and the lack of security, the kind of the attack on the attachment system that makes you question things. So I always remember feeling very unsettled.
Mm.
I always remember feeling very conflicted. I always remember feeling very adult,
Yeah.
that I had to, that I felt a lot of pressure, a lot of responsibility because of the narrative around mum. I was like, I'm one of the people that looks after her, which is not necessarily something that a child shouldn't feel, but for the right reasons, if that makes sense. Whereas mine was very much induced. I think it was you have to be here. Um, so that I've always felt like I've carried a lot of weight, I think, and I think that began then, because I feel like I had to grow up very fast and um, deal with things that were very, heavy and above my childhood.
Sure.
And a lot of that was induced, with the great irony being that both parties claimed that at the time they were just trying to protect me or do things in my best interest, whereas actually that kind of coalesced into doing the opposite. Um, in terms of the later years, I mean, the actual alienating behaviors themselves died down a lot because my residency transferred to my dad.
Okay. And I'm sorry.
Well,
I just have a
well,
sorry for interrupting. I just have
yeah, no, no,
a
please.
question. Um, so the court battle, you said it lasted 4 years?
So there was 2 years out of court where they were trying to settle it before going to court.
Okay.
My dad, advocating for his position, saying, that he would basically like 50-50, especially considering that my mum was ill, etc. And it just wasn't being received very well. Um, and then there was a court process initiated by my dad actually midway through to say, look, I think it's actually right that he comes and lives with me because I feel like I'm better placed to care with him, which he almost certainly was. Um, and in 1995, so halfway through that process, he had remarried and I had a step sibling that I gained. So there was a kind of family unit there for me to grow up in relative normalcy versus being with a very sick mother and grandparents. Um, and, from the conversations we've had about it recently, he was not and was never trying to limit contact with that side of the family. That's how they took it, but he was just trying to get the contact that he was owed and that he felt was best for me. But everybody feels they're doing the best thing at the time. But yeah, so then we had a 2-year court process, and then about a year into that, my maternal grandmother was diagnosed with lung cancer, but they didn't disclose that to the court. They kept the court case going
Mm.
without divulging that. And then a day before the final hearing, they rang my dad and said, "Oh no, we can't actually have him. You can have him. You can pick him up in a week." So they'd purposefully kept the case going to kind of financially and emotionally break my dad, um,
Wow.
without thinking that it kept me in a court case for another year. So
Right.
um, yeah. So I then a week later residency transferred to my dad, and I went to live. So the pattern completely flipped,
Right.
because I'd been having 12 days with my mum and 2 with my dad, and it changed to 12 days with my dad, 2 days with mum, which was a huge adjustment. Um, One of the memories I do distinctly, well, 2 memories I have are of that day. One of my dad picking me up and me crying when we got round the corner because I was leaving, my mum's house. But then the kind of really overwhelmed feeling of drawing up to the driveway and seeing a welcome home banner on the house and my stepmom and my stepsister being there, like, oh, we're so glad you're here. Blah, blah. So a real kind of, again, mess of emotions. And then,
What was that like? What was that like for you? I can't even imagine what you must have been so confused.
yeah, just confusion, instability, taking a long time to adjust to new people, new rules, new rooms, new schools. I'd been to different schools, and I'd got settled at my school where I live with my grandparents. Then I had to reintegrate with the school, where my dad lived. So yeah, I mean, it was just complete and utter confusion. And I think the thing I would be very clear on is that I think you can go through processes where you resolve and figure out shared parenting that does involve switch of residency and does involve time spent here, time spent there. Because the response that some people will have to this is, well, that surely is the case for not having shared custody because you should give children stability. But you give children stability principally through the way that you talk to them and the way that you care for them. So the reason that that was so confusing and unstable was because of all the narrative and discussion flying around. It wasn't the actual thing itself. It wasn't moving house itself, because I probably could have handled that if it wasn't accompanied by all of this toxicity and acrimony. But anyway,
Awesome.
um,
And you said during the court case they gave you a say as a child. They asked you.
yeah, which I don't agree with. From my own perspective, we need more
I don't.
research on it. But just from my own perspective, I did not enjoy that. I I probably superficially looked like I wanted to say, and I think a lot of kids would say that they wanted to
Mhm.
say, but I think a lot of kids feel that they need to say that because they feel that they need to act grown up, which is part of the problem. And I think realistically, if courts were good enough at understanding the best interests of the child to begin with, they wouldn't need to bring children into it and fundamentally expose them to a process that they shouldn't be part of. Um, because you can't, and my case is a prime example, you cannot trust the voice of the child, because whenever I was interviewed in location A, I would say, I want to stay in location A because I was in location A. Whenever I was interviewed in location B, I would say, I want to stay in location B because I was in location B. So my testimony was pretty much inadmissible anyway because it was useless. So all it did was pressure me into feeling more of that loyalty conflict. So yeah, I've probably got a lot more than many to say about the voice of the child and what that should be like. But we do need more research on it as well.
I have the same opinion. I think it's really
Mm,
wrong to force a child to choose
mm,
and have legal repercussions because of that.
yeah.
When you say they, I know in your book you mentioned that it's primarily your grandparents who did the
Mm.
alienation, but what role did your mom have in the alienation?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, it was a fairly limited role because she became quite ill very quickly
Okay.
after my parents' divorce. She, was quite rapidly becoming progressively more kind of immobile, and losing certain powers of speech, etc. And she had several kind of large episodes that placed her in a position of quite severe disability. And so, I mean, for me, I don't have many memories of my mum, and I think that's probably because anything she did say was probably clouded in a broader trauma of her just being ill. To be quite honest, I don't really know as much about her role. I mean, and I don't know how much information I would be given by my dad because he's also now very mindful of not tarnishing her memory. But from the limited information that I do have, is that she was in line with the views that my grandparents held and gave. Whether she then translated those kind of directly to me, or whether it was just support by omission, so not challenging those views and saying, no, actually, he's a good guy. Either way, she must have played some kind of role in reinforcing the kind of narrative that was being put forward. Um,
Thanks for clearing that up. That's something I was just wondering, but that makes
yeah.
sense to me. Um, so you moved to the custody is reversed pretty much,
Mhm.
and you go to your dad's house. And what was
Mhm.
that like? Do you remember anything about your relationship with your dad when you first moved in there? And did you stay were under his custody until you were 18 then?
Yeah, so I mean, I moved into what then became, and up until recently was still our kind of family home, of my dad, my stepmom, my stepsister. Um, I mean, it was tumultuous. It was very tumultuous. I think, trying to, yeah, figure out this new kind of relationship with my dad, which was, immediately better than it had been previously,
Mhm.
because I got that kind of prolonged exposure where I was like, okay, well, this guy's clearly not a monster,
Yeah.
but still with those residual seeds kind of in the back of my mind of, yeah, but he still did kind of leave mum and that kind of thing. So it kind of, we got into this amicable position.
Mhm.
Um, and then with my stepmom, it was very tumultuous, kind of adjusting a bit, but again, always a tale of two halves, because I had desperately yearned for a mother figure because my mum was ill. But by the same token, it was kind of like, oh, but I don't, and because the alienation doesn't just happen to the parent, it happens to any new partner of the parent.
Mhm.
So the amount of narrative that I got about my stepmom
Mhm.
was also massive and vitriolic and painted her in a bad light as well.
Yeah.
So it was also adjusting to her, and she ran her house in a very different way,
Mhm.
and we had very different rules that my sister was used to. I was not. So there was a big disconnect between us as well. And I should mention at this point, I'm exceptionally close to my stepsister now. Yeah, we took a long time to adjust. It was very tumultuous, very confusing, but we did settle. I think the main trauma from that time comes from the aftermath of the court case, where you still had two parties that were bitterly against each other. Um, and as such, I didn't feel able to kind of overlap the two spheres of my life, one of which had this new family that I was adjusting to, and I couldn't really talk to anybody about how difficult that was. And then on the other sphere, I had my mum who was really severely ill still,
Mhm.
and I couldn't talk to anyone about that on the other side. So
Yeah.
I had these two separate, very separate lives that I was leading, both of which were really, really difficult, but
Wow.
no one to really talk about either with, because they both still hated each other.
Yeah. Did you ever feel like if you were to allow yourself to have a good time or get closer to your stepmom or your dad or your siblings as if you were betraying your mom?
It was always in the back of my mind, I think, and it was always in the back of my mind that I had someone who was very unwell and who needed me. And, I think that would be a very natural impulse anyway, to care
Mhm.
for someone. I think the level above that is the kind of loyalty element to it that was fed, because I think anybody would care for and want to care for a dying parent. I mean, say anybody, but I think it'd be a natural impulse to do that. I think the feeling of, yeah, that almost kind of hint of betrayal was what was constructed. I don't think that would have been there otherwise.
Well, it seems, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, no, go on.
It seems like such a perfect storm because at least for me and what the research I've done talking to other people who've been through it and my own personal experience, it's like the alienator, especially severe alienator, they use parentification and
Hmm.
victimization, self-victimization to trap the
Hmm.
child into feeling
Yeah.
responsible for them in every way and taking care of their emotions. So the fact that your mom was actually
Yeah.
sick as a victim, it's like, oh my
Mm.
gosh, that must have been so confusing because
Mm.
you were feeling bad for her. You know what I'm saying? Like that
Yeah,
guilt.
no, it's kind of like, it's, even if somebody's written a book, actually, when I just position myself not as an author and an academic, but if I'm just speaking to you as an alienated child, it's kind of, that's exactly what it was, because it was this perfect storm of, because it's almost as if she had a legitimate reason
Yes.
of breeding that. And, in a perfect world, the narrative that would have been is what I've had to self teach, which is, your mum loves you, she wants you to be happy, so go and have fun. But it was never that. It
Mm.
was, you should be here. And actually, that is why I'm certain that then I felt such all consuming drive to care for her in my teenage years
Wow.
as much as I could, within the confines of still needing to get an education and, only being able to get the train so much, etc. But, when, I mean, I became part of her care team when I was 14. So, and I insisted. I was like, I have to be the one to look after her, because by that point, my both my grandparents had actually passed by
Oh,
2003,
okay.
which is when I was 14. So they were gone. My mother's brother was thrust with all this responsibility that he himself would admit he was not prepared for, ready for, could able to enact. So I felt very compelled to kind of
Mm.
be part of that care team. And I think the reason I was so driven, and the reason that my dad and my stepmom didn't step in and say, look, I'm sorry, but it's not appropriate for you to do that, is because of the narrative that I'd been fed, and that I was just so adamant, and they didn't want to upset the apple cart either. So yeah, I was taking part in, care reviews that, weren't appropriate and were extremely distressing, because we had care reviews around putting in a feeding tube, and I was part of the discussions around that, whether to put in a feeding tube, what type of feeding tube, etc.
As a
um
14-year-old, 15-year-old,
yeah, well,
16.
that was slightly older, but yeah, 16, 17, I mean, still really young. And I was sat in a meeting when I was 16, where they were discussing a potential sexual harassment case where a carer had inappropriately touched my mum because she was bedbound. And I was sat 16 kind of discussing that, weighing in, um, which, you know, any regular person who hasn't been alienated that I speak to says, you've got to be joking.
Like how, who allowed that? Like how did the
But,
hospital even
it's
allow
just,
that?
it was this perfect storm of being, the great irony being that you belong to two families, but at the same time, neither.
Right.
And that's where this kind of, I think this feeling of aloneness and isolation, I think really kicked in across my teenage years, and then culminated in what I view to be the kind of pinnacle event of the alienation and its aftermath. Um, I don't know, should I talk about that now?
Um, I, well, can I ask you one question before we
Yeah,
wrap
I do,
this
yeah.
up? Is there anything that you believe could have ended the alienation at any point until this point? And also, were you taken to therapy at any point?
No, not no. The only therapy I've ever had is kind of self-driven and also relatively recent. Kind of, yeah, well, 7 years ago now, but not as a child. And it was just, like I said, I think everyone was so paralyzed by their own trauma,
Mm.
that I just kind of got lost in the wash of it. But both parties just didn't want to talk about the other. So there was no opportunity to have a discussion. And in that sense, there was almost reverse alienation that occurred, because, on part of my dad and my stepmom, because they kind of, and I understand that. And I've had conversations with them about this many times, and I understand why. But because of the trauma they suffered from the court case and the alienation that had occurred towards them, when it was over, they just said, we're cutting these people out of our life. Now, that was a decision they could take for them, but it had a direct impact on me, because those people I can't cut out of my life. One of them is my mum, and she's dying, and one of them is my granddad, who I love, and my uncle, and all that kind of thing. So it was just, yeah, there was nothing, but there wasn't anything proactive ever done to kind of, yeah, understand that in any
For
great.
you, like it doesn't sound like anyone's considered you or tried to get you
Mm.
help or
Again, I think, and I've spoken to my parents a lot about this. We're in a really good place about it all. But, I think one of the things that I have spoken to them about and levied at them is that they took the easy road, because it was easier for them if they didn't probe how I was feeling.
mm,
Because if they did, I might share, and then they'd have to get into it. Blah, blah. So they've been very kind of forthcoming of saying, look, that was a massive error on our part. And also, where I had been parentified and adultified, I was an adult at 14. I was speaking in, and I like to think of myself, and I've been told I'm fairly intelligent as well. So I think when you have that together, and as a child who's been raised by grandparents, I was very old for my age,
sure.
quite precocious, very strong willed. And, if I said I wanted to be part of my mum's care team, I was going to be part of my mum's care team. But that was because I was acting as if I was an adult who could make my own decisions because I'd been led to believe that.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Whereas if my son, if this same situation happened with me and my wife, and we were split, and I would be saying, no, 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 sorry, I'm your father. I know, I need to make this call for you. But I think everyone was also just so scared of doing the wrong thing because of everything that had happened. And of course, alienated parents also don't want to do anything that reinforces the child's view of them.
Yeah, very
So
good point.
if you've been fed a lie about someone that they don't care or blah, 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 they want to avoid doing anything to fulfill that. And that includes, for example, maybe setting boundaries or doing this, doing that. So, it was very difficult. I don't blame anybody. But yeah, to answer your question, no, like I said, I got caught in the wash of it all, I think.
Sounds like it. I want to get into how the parental alienation played out in different areas of your life and affected
Mhm.
you. But if you want to talk about that other event first, if that
Well,
makes more sense.
only because I think if and I guess I'll segue into what you just asked in terms of the different domains, because that basically when I was 18, uh and bear in mind over these years my mum had been getting progressively ill, so it wasn't exactly a surprise, but I got a call when I was 18. I just started uni to say that my mum had had a really, really bad attack, and it looked really bad and she probably wasn't going to make it. And so, I went to the hospital, and my stepmom actually came and drove me to the hospital. Um, Went to the hospital, and I jointly decided with my uncle to withdraw care from my mum, which was
You
again a huge decision at 18 to say, because my uncle had power of attorney, but he shared it with me in all but on paper. He said, any decision, it will involve you. Again, would we do that? I don't know. But I went to the hospital. We had a conversation with the doctor where he said, look, we could do this massive surgery. It'd be more pain. We think it's time. And so my uncle and I jointly decided to withdraw care. Directly following that meeting, my uncle left the hospital because he said it's just too much for him. He's overwhelmed, etc. And of course, my stepmom had left because she said she didn't think it was right for her to be there. And I get that. And my dad didn't come because he didn't feel it was right for him to be there either. But through everybody dealing with their own trauma again, I was then left. So I spent 3 days, 2 nights with various peripheral people. So my uncle's wife, my auntie, who I was semi close with at the time, a few carers. But in terms of the people that I needed, I was on my own. Um, just watching my mum pass away over 3 days. Um, was there when she died. I was holding her hand when she died. Um, Heard her last breath, felt her pulse go, fundamentally alone. And I think, coming on to your question about what areas of your life it affected, I mean, that fundamentally broke me as a person, um, into a million pieces. And I'm not talking about I fundamentally do not believe it would have been as bad if people had been there, because no one's going to turn around and say, well, a death of a mother is always easy. It's never easy. But it was just so painfully traumatic in the sense that I remember the first night, actually, it wasn't even the death. It was the first night when everyone had left. And I had said, as I always did at that age, I said, well, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying because I need to be here. It's my job. It's my role as an 18-year-old child to be here when she's dying. And I was sat alone, 2 a.m. in the morning. I was watching some black and white movie on the TV. And I was just holding her hand, and she was just there. She was drugged, very high up. Um, but she was still there. She was just holding my hand. And I just remember feeling and thinking, I have no one. And I am about to lose the one person that I have right now. And that it just deconstructed me, I think, just completely. I had nothing. I left that hospital with nothing in terms of my own psychological well-being and sense of self. It was shattered. into a billion pieces. And that for me has been the biggest impact, I think, because I'm still building myself. I'm still building myself. I still deal with that feeling of aloneness, even though I'm sure come on to this in terms of a healing journey of some sorts. I'm close with my dad. I'm close with my stepmom. I'm happily married. I have 2 children. There's still the most tiniest, invisiblest of barriers where I just think, yeah, but still fundamentally, you're still alone. Um, and it is changing, and it's been worn down. I mean, it used to be a massive, great concrete wall between me and the world, where I said
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what anyone does, I'm on my own. Um, and it's got thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, but it's still there. And that's over a decade later. Um, and that was a result of the alienation and the court case, because that's why people weren't there. Because when my granddad died, a few years ago now, um, the family did. But this is my dad's dad, so a different side of the story, because my dad's parents, my grandparents, are most wonderful people. Um, Especially my grandma, who's still alive. She's 90, and she's just my favorite person. Um, and when he died, we all came together. The whole
You weren't
family was
alone.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were all in the same room. It was like all of us, or anyone who, there was about, yeah, 9 of us. We all came together, and there was a great calmness and serenity and love in that. Even though it was traumatic and he still died, it was actually quite, dare I say, nice in a way, because we were celebrating, joking, sharing memories. It was the complete antithesis
Mm.
of how I experienced my mother's death, which was just, just ripped me asunder. I basically planned her funeral alone, chose everything. I delivered her eulogy alone. I just felt alone.
I am so sorry. Like I really, no, I really am. I mean,
Thank you.
it sounds like a big part of your identity, and this is not
Mm,
even, it wasn't even, I don't think it was even your choice, but to be her caretaker.
mm,
Sounds like that was a big part of your obligation, your identity, and
mm,
the fact that you were alone in her final days with her.
mm,
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that happened.
mm.
Everything you said has made complete sense to me.
And just to build on that question about different areas, I mean, one of the things I would caution people against with alienation is how they see it outwardly manifesting in the child. Because one of the key myths is that if a child is doing well in school,
Oh, yeah.
then he's not alien. I've always been, and I'm sorry if this sounds arrogant, but I've always been completely fine at school.
Me too,
To the
Ben. Yeah,
point,
me
yeah,
too.
to the point where I don't, I've never really struggled. I haven't had to work that hard, especially until I got up to degree level where I worked very hard. But basically, a lot up until that point, I found it very easy and I excelled and I enjoyed it. And also, what I did is I funneled a lot of my trauma into academia because, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So you get it, and a lot of people listening will get it because, and that's not to say some alienated children will perform poorly academically. Some will because it will
Mhm.
affect them in that way. But it's not enough to say no, no, they're doing fine academically, so they're not alienated. Because I was always fine, and actually, my parents said to me, what we did by accident was believe exactly that, because you weren't going out taking
Oh,
drugs, you didn't engage in substance use until I got to uni. Um, and I was doing fine academically, straight A's and A stars, GPA, I know the American equivalent, 4.0, grade point average, etc. So I was absolutely fine. And I think and I remember them distinctly saying, oh, you're doing so well and you're fine. And like, do you know what I mean? Like almost buying
wow.
into their
Yeah.
own myth about it. And then I felt that I had to convince myself I was okay because I was doing well at school. Because if I'm doing well at school, I should be okay. Do you know what I mean? So
Yes.
school was never affected. And actually, I sought a lot of validation through school. It's the one place. And actually, I've been, some of the people I've actually got closest to have been my academic mentors. Really random, but my chemistry teacher in college, so high school for you guys, took great interest in me because of what she knew about me personally, and was really kind, was always very supportive, nominated me for certain, awards, and was always willing to listen. And actually, this is why I put such passion into my education journey. And also I support like my local school, because I know how important teachers are, because actually they were some of the people that listened the most, helped me the most. My university personal tutor, Polly Dalton, shout out to Professor Polly Dalton. Um, she was phenomenal at supporting me through my degree, making sure I didn't go completely off the radar, keeping me involved in my studies. But yeah, generally, I mean, that's where I've plowed my self-worth and my
Me too.
validation and my energy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's never been a problem. It's more been self-esteem,
Mm.
self-confident. I seem very outwardly like a confident person, but I'm not. I have rock bottom self-esteem. Um, and because of the attack on attachment, trouble, forming relationships, knowing what to do in relationships, sometimes being overly selfish or overly this or overly that, because I'm just this, less so now, but was this just fluid blob. I always used to also do this thing. I very much outsource my self-esteem. So external validation is what I need to feel that I'm making the right decision or feeling good about myself, etc. So even now when I do something, it'll always be to my wife. I'm like, was that okay? Like, is that went well? Blah blah
Yeah.
blah.
Yeah. I have that.
And yeah, and so I always used to really struggle putting across my own opinion because of that. I would always
Mm.
wait to see what the opinion of a group or a room was, and
Mhm.
then I would be like, oh yeah, me too. Um, yeah, so lots of different areas, and of course, parenting has been a difficult journey.
I really
Very,
want to talk to you about that. Yeah.
yeah,
Um, before I want to get to that in a little bit, but before
yeah,
we
yeah,
get to that, I would love to hear how you came to learn the truth.
yeah. Through my work, through academia saved me, in more ways than one. Yeah, it's very bizarre, because I think people automatically, if they see that you're really interested in something, I think they think that you've always been interested in it.
Mhm.
Um, but I've only come to this space in the last 3 years. But trust me, since I have come to it, I've read everything. But it has only been 3 years, and it came about because I'd done some work on sexual violence just through meeting a colleague and showing an interest in that, just from a passing kind of, oh, that's interesting. That moved on to domestic violence, and that moved on to domestic violence towards men. And when we interviewed the men and spoke to men about their violence and practitioners, they all mentioned use of children. And I was like, oh, I'd never really thought about that before. So
Ah.
then Liz Bates and I, who I'm sure you know, did a massive study on, we didn't even call it parental alienation. We called it weaponizing of children
Mm.
post-separation. And we had 171 men reply to our survey and talk about their experiences. And it was in 2020. We all remember 2020, quiet year. And I was up in my loft study. It was during the pandemic. I had this big wad of data, raw data, printed it all out from all the testimonies. And I found myself for the first time ever trying to analyze something and just not being able to get through reading it without being really emotional,
Wow.
feeling really affected. Had a few conversations with Liz about this, and then came to the epiphany that it's because I was seeing myself in the text, and I was seeing
Wow.
my dad in the text. And I said to Liz, I think this happened to me. I think my dad is one of these men, and I think I'm the children they're talking about.
Oh my
Through
gosh.
tears, which was very embarrassing because she was a colleague at that time, and she's now a good friend as well. But I was like, oh, I'm really sorry. She said, no, you've clearly got a personal connection with the data. So read some more about it. And she then suggested that I do what's called an autoethnography, which is where you look at the literature through the lens of personal experience. Um, and then I had a brilliant professor in my school suggest that I try and do that with my dad, because it would be interesting to get his perspective on it.
Mhm.
So it was in 20, it was at the end of 2020, actually. I reached out to my dad and I said, you'll never guess what I'm doing at work at the moment. I'm looking at this phenomenon and I think maybe you might have something to say about it. And I remember it was Christmas 2020, and I said, "Why don't you come to the house?" My no, it was Christmas 2021. It took quite a while, but I said, "Why don't you come to the house, and I want you to tell me, no holds barred, start to finish, your story for the first time." Because there'd been a few times before that where I had gone to him and I had levied this at him, I had levied that at him, and I'd said, "You abandoned mum, you didn't come and see me at the hospital, you're this, you're that." And he could see, amazingly for him, he was still protecting me
Wow.
from that abuse because he didn't respond and say, "Well, let me tell you something." He just took it all at that time because he knew I wasn't ready, because I didn't look ready, I didn't sound ready, because I was angry. And all the emotion I had at that time was still anger rather than any other. So he just sat there and he said, "Yeah, I messed up," you know,
Wow.
which was a huge thing for him to do because he must have been sat there thinking, "I'm still painted in this way." But I said to him, "Look, I've had a lot of therapy. I'm doing this at work. It's really important to me. I'm however old I was then. I said, I'm 32. I'm ready." So he sat down and gave me the most eye-opening 3 hours of my life that I've ever had. We sat, we talked through, and every 5 minutes was like a big rewriting of a
Yeah.
certain event or a certain key thing or a certain, and in a way that he was very honest. And he said, I promise you, I'm going to give you my version of the truth. And I am going to be as balanced as I can be here. And he was. And he said, "Look, yes, did I react badly at this time? Yes. And did I do this at this time? Yes. And should I have maybe come to the hospital? Yes. But here's why all of that happened." And, gave me a lot of context on the relationship breakdown, etc. So after that conversation, we then both went away and we wrote our memories of the time
Wow.
separately
Wow.
about our experiences, and then he sent them to me and I married them up. And there are some that I remember more, some that he remembers more, and some we both have written about because they're
Yeah.
clearly and I'll of course send that to you, that chapter. um so it kind of really lit this fire across both domains. Personally, I'd had this revelation informed by the work to sit down and have that very healing kind of conversation with my dad, and now we're continuing that healing kind of journey and speaking more about things, and little things like opening up space for my mum as well, for my birth mother Jo to exist, because actually until a few years ago I didn't feel like there was space for mum, whereas now we can talk about her at Christmas, and it's bringing space for things. um but that was how. So I thank the work, and I thank the work of the people who've come before me.
Mhm.
So the brilliant Jennifer Harmon, Demosthenes Lorandos, Bill Burnett, all of Amy Baker, all of these titans of the area that have paved the way for me to not only professionally take up the mantle, because I have great belief in the necessity for us to explore this more because of the impact it has on targeted parents, but principally targeted children,
Yes.
but
Yes.
also the gift it's given to me personally. And that's why whenever I've met them, I've said, "I'm going to greet you and talk to you in two roles. So let me do my academic one first, and then I'll thank you
Yeah.
personally second." But yeah, it's been a wild 3 years, that's for sure.
Now you're one of the people that I get to thank too, because you're doing this professionally too. So many things
Trying,
come
I'm
to
trying.
mind when you're telling me about how you essentially went to your dad and asked for his side of the story for the first time, and I did that too. And as you're telling me about your dad taking accountability in certain ways, and then telling you the truth of other things he probably didn't want you to know,
Yeah, yeah.
that's exactly how it was for me. I remember my dad taking accountability for things, and I was surprised because my mom never did that. Um,
No, yeah.
but
And a lot of the time alienators don't.
yeah,
um, and the interesting thing is that you get opened up to the version of a parent that you should have in the first place, because nobody is infallible. There is no
yeah,
such thing as a perfect parent. And the picture of my dad that he painted of himself, and that I believe to be true, is one of a good enough parent, what we
Yeah.
call a good enough parent, because that's what we all really can realistically
Yeah.
ever be, is a good enough parent. Did he lose his rag a few times? Sure. Could he have responded better to X, Y, and Z? Sure. But so could anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Was he fundamentally a loving father? Yes. Was it justified that he was disrupted, his relationship with me was disrupted? No. And that's the key takeaways that I took from the conversation, especially the feeling loved part.
So I want to move on, but before we do, I just have to ask. So when I found out the truth, I'm curious about your experience because when I found out the truth, it was a new trauma. Did you have any type of response to learning the truth? What was that like?
I mean,
What was
yeah,
that
I mean,
like for
I
you?
made sure that I was in therapy at the time, and
Mhm.
I was like, when I had that conversation, I had a therapy session booked in for the next day where I was basically like, because it's one thing, to deconstruct someone's idea of the world. It's another to also reconstruct it as well. Both of those things, it's not, and that makes complete sense what you're saying, because I think it would also be wrong for people to think, oh, when kids or adults learn the truth, then it's like, oh, okay, I'm healed, it's done. Oh, thank goodness, because it breeds a whole new raft of emotions, because you're then angry again because you've been lied to for so long. You're angry at you're potentially angry at the targeted parent for not doing more because you don't realistically know what it's like to be alienated. It brings this whole new raft. Oh, not least because I also had another interesting conversation around that time, which was with my mother's brother, who is the last remaining actor from the other side.
Okay.
And he still maintains the other side. Even when I say to him, I've been told this, what do you make of that? And he says, no, it's not true. So I fundamentally believe my dad,
Mhm.
but I still have nuggets of doubt and
Mhm.
because the messaging was for so long and so
Mhm.
consistent and is still being repeated by certain actors.
Mhm.
Um, and I also got given, for better or for worse, by my uncle, my case file that he had kept all of these years. So I got to go through and see all the letters that have been written by each side and have that um, coexistence of truths in
Wow.
black and white in front of me, because the people writing these things genuinely believe that both versions are true. So you have one person saying A and the other person saying Z, and you're like, how do I reconcile this? So that was a whole new wave of things to deal with, which was reconstructing my idea of what had happened, and again stuck in another blooming loyalty conflict about who to believe. Um, but this time, you know, being with my dad because I believe him. He was,
Yeah.
I just do. I have it in my heart that I believe him, and that's what I want to believe as well. So but it is difficult. It breeds a whole new raft of issues, and
But
similarly as parenting does, it's a
yeah.
whole new battle, a whole new frontier that you think, oh, maybe if I've dealt with this, at least I'm there. And then you get a kid, and you're like, oh, it's a whole new set of challenges.
I can't even imagine what kind of pain that caused you in terms of your view of your mom, because talking to other child survivors whose alienator, and somewhat she was an alienator, it seems like,
Yeah,
but the grandparents were the primary.
yeah,
But
yeah,
um, once you learn the truth, it seems as if some of them discard the child, smear campaign the child, the
yeah.
whole 9 yards, or the child has to put up boundaries with the parent.
Mm,
In my case, I haven't spoken to my mom in about a year and a half now. Like, it's
mm,
not safe. So I wonder what
mm.
that was like for you. And we don't have to talk about that if you don't want to, because I imagine
No,
it's very painful.
no, I'm happy to. I think there's two things I would say on that. The first thing is it. I'm unsure for several reasons, both on his part and mine. I'm unsure whether I will get a relationship with my uncle back,
Mhm.
because after he gave me that file, I would imagine he was potentially expecting a call for me to say, okay, I see what you mean. I believe you. And I haven't, because I don't. And I don't know whether that presents an irreconcilable position between us, whether he needs me to believe that side in order for us to have a relationship. I don't know. And from my part, I also find it very triggering to have that link to that side of my family, because the side of my family where my mum died. So that's a very complicated relationship. Um, yeah, and yeah, it's very interesting. And about my mum, it was very it was difficult. It was difficult. The only real memories I have of my mum are when she was rightfully occupying that very victimized position
Mhm.
because she was extremely ill.
Mhm.
Um, and not just ill, she was ill with a very ugly and very horrible disease that was very hard to watch. And so I certainly had martyred my mum in my mind
Mhm.
uh, for several years in terms of she was fully wronged and she was the same. And, it was important that he did. And I'm glad that he did. But part of the story that my dad had to tell was my mum's role in the relationship breaking down.
Mhm.
And that was difficult. That was difficult to hear because I think you want to keep a certain version of someone in your mind. Um, so yeah, that was tough parts of the puzzle to kind of fit in, but it was important. But yeah, that's probably all I'll say on that.
Okay. So I want to move to your book, if we can. I know this
Yeah.
interview is going long. I'm sorry. I had a feeling
No,
you got speaking.
it feels very, naturally long. It's not as if it's,
Yeah.
hopefully people listening won't be like, oh, these guys have been talking for ages.
Yeah. So when I learned the truth, I was looking for help, basically, anything to get me
Mm,
through. And I'm very grateful for all the research that exists. But I do think there is a lot of room to continue this research and hopefully come up
mm,
with the best treatment for kids upon learning the truth and how to
yeah,
basically unbrainwash yourself. So I feel like a
yeah,
lot of the time, from my point of view, I've been white knuckling it, kind of
yeah,
figuring out how to
yeah,
do
yeah.
this. What have you found helpful for deprogramming your brain and for moving forward and um,
Mm.
overcoming the beliefs that you've had about your dad for so long?
I'm lucky because my job in that sense is made a lot easier through the exposure that I have because I have a relationship. And the thing is even though it began very severely, the alienation, I at least still saw my dad throughout that
Mhm.
custody process. Many people don't see the
Mhm.
alienated parent at all. And I think, I'm not painting myself here as the ultimate victim of parental alienation because a lot of children have it a lot worse. So I'm very lucky in that sense, is that a lot of my healing has come simply through spending time with the man
Yeah.
because he's a lovely guy.
Oh,
He is, and
yeah.
there's other things that again have been beyond my control. So seeing him with my son as a
Yes.
grandparent has been immense. I mean, a little triggering, been a little jealous. I'm not gonna lie,
Yeah.
because you're looking at a relationship you got robbed of, but it's fine. We process those feelings in therapy and we move on. But it's also been very joyous and very healing to see that because I'm just glad that my son gets that. And, you know, my son, for example, is really into sports. Now that's not through my doing because I'm not into sports because I wasn't into sports because I was told not to be into sports. But he's just is all his mates are into he's football or soccer crazy at the moment. Um, and they were sat there because we're visiting them at the moment. They were sat there the other night, and my dad was helping him put his little football cards in his wallet. And I was like, great, lovely, and
Oh,
that helps. Um, but the main driver, I think, for writing the book was because I did feel there was something missing in the form of an accessible text that if people had or were pointed towards the term PA, that this would hopefully be the go-to book that would give them the avenue to other books. Because what I noticed from digesting every single thing in the area was we had a load of books on one side that were really good academic analyses of the topic. Mandy Mathewson and Mary Haynes's book is a prime example of that, a great detailed academic text. And on the other side, we had a few people who had written in detail exclusively about their personal story.
mhm.
And it was kind of a narrative novel type piece. And I thought there was something missing maybe in the middle that was bridging and giving people a window to the academic if they wanted it, but also just in plain English, here's what's happening, here's how we measure it, here's the impact, and here's what we do about it. So that was my drive, because I noticed that kind of gap, maybe where people are put onto the term, or they think they might know what's going on with them, but they don't really know where to start. And I was hoping that this book would be people's start that would then lead them to other things.
Wow, I think you definitely accomplished your goal because
Thank
that's
you.
exactly what the impression that I got from reading it was that I think it's the perfect book for every therapist. It needs to be part of the education of like every
Thank you. I
child
really
and
appreciate
family
that.
and
And I
therapist.
should shout out that my stepmom did the artwork for the cover.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's so meaningful. I love that.
so she painted it and provided it, which, like I said, is really, yeah, it is really meaningful, because obviously she lived it with us. So yeah.
Yeah, I would add guardian ad litems,
Yeah.
judges, and
Yeah.
family lawyers. I mean, I think, and just the average layperson who comes in
Yeah.
contact. It's amazing
No, thank
how
you for
you
that. I
took
appreciate that.
this. Well, it's such a complex. You're welcome. I mean it. That is what I came away with. Like, it's such a complex subject matter, and you were able to tease out all of
Mm,
the important parts that people really need to know.
thank
And
you.
the way you organized it was so easy to follow. And it's I think there is something really profound about a child survivor
Mm,
going in to study this as well, and you have the academic credits and the credibility there to
thank
I am
you.
so glad that you wrote this book. And
Well, I'm glad, because it took a piece of me with it. It was a big thing that I sat down and I said I'm going to do, and then not immediately regretted it, but was like, wow, okay, I have actually set myself a massive task. And so I'm glad people are receiving it well, because it did take a chunk of me with it. But
yeah,
yeah, I'm really glad. I'm just really glad that
you've already discussed about what made you decide to write the book, but I'm curious about what was the most surprising part or surprising thing you learned when throughout the process of writing your book.
I think one of the biggest things was, so you'll notice, I believe it's chapter 8, which is on early intervention. And I think in writing that, it was the revelation that we can think about intervening when PA has already happened, and we can think about the application in legal context, and we should, because there are plenty of individuals out there for whom it's already happened or is happening. But I think the biggest revelation came is that realistically, the best intervention for alienation is to stop it beginning.
Mm.
And really kind of tackling the bigger problems. And I gave a lecture recently about a project that I did with fathers, but obviously we know PA is a gender symmetrical issue, but it really did speak to this idea that we need to tackle things on a much, much broader scale. For example, how we equip couples to be effective parenting couples in the first place,
Mm.
how we talk about separation and divorce more generally, how we need to make it less acrimonious more generally. So I think that was one of the biggest things when I was really trying to dissect, okay, what do we know about intervention? What do we know about how it's brought forward in courts, and what a mess the legal system is in dealing with this, etc. It really just all led me back to, I think, as much as I want to work in those areas, and I'm, trying to do projects on the courts now with data, all that kind of thing. One of the things I'm really excited about is a project that I'm working on at the moment, which is an app for separating parents
Mm.
that will assess their emotional readiness to deal with their separation, and then point them towards effective kind of co-parenting strategies, and giving them guidance on how they should be talking about their ex and things. So I think it's that was one of the biggest things for me, because as someone operating in the area, I kind of, nothing about the impact was surprising, because I've lived it. Nothing about what we know about alienation and how it occurs was really that surprising. I'd read so much about parental alienating behaviors and the 5-factor model. I was like, okay, this is kind of bread and butter stuff. It was then when I was focusing on the kind of intervention section, the third section, where I was kind of really wrapping my head around this idea that we need to get in there early, stop people early, and also just change opinions and policy around family structures much more broadly. So that to me, I think was the biggest thing that I came to.
Oh, there's a part where you talk about the effects on the alienated child and the targeted parent. And as I was reading through it, which is this is something I've noticed before, but your book really highlighted it. For me, it was I noticed very similar effects on both the targeted parent and the alienated child. For example, CPTSD, health
Mm-hmm.
issues,
Mm-hmm.
suicidal ideation. And I just was wondering, what are your thoughts on why this might be?
I think it's because I mean, it's a very similar pattern to what we see with other forms of abuse, what we might call traditional domestic violence, of which parental alienation is a form, just to be clear. But we're still working on kind of framing it and recognizing it as such. But what we do know about other forms of violence is that children, when we've traditionally talked about children in terms of domestic violence, we've talked about them as witnesses, as if they're
Mm-hmm.
somehow removed from the violence. But what we have seen in the traditional literature is this shared victimization, because you don't necessarily have to experience directly, you don't have to be the one being punched in order to be affected by someone being punched.
Mm-hmm.
When that person is someone that you really care about, especially. So it's a very similar pattern in that abuse, if it occurs within the proximity of a person, will have a similar impact, whether you're the direct recipient or not. So, for example, if we look at alienating behaviors and we look at, the reason we call them the target parent is because it's about them. So if you're denigrating them, it's about them, but you're using the child as a vehicle. They're not a witness to that abuse. They are experiencing the abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, if you are holding and transferring that abuse through you, it's no wonder that you would have a similar effect to the recipient, because
Wow.
you are still essentially receiving it. So that's why those patterns of symptomology are so similar, because we're not, as children, we are not witnesses, we are target children. So we are children being used to target the parent. And that's why it's such a damaging form of abuse. And that's really the message that I would have thread, and hopefully I have thread throughout the whole book, is just to place gravity on the situation
Mm-hmm.
and to say, look, I've spelled out in plain English, sure, how we measure it and blah, blah, but throughout this, surely right from the start, in terms of just talking about the behaviors through to the support that's needed to deal with it, hopefully anybody reading it takes away nothing else than this is really serious.
Mm-hmm.
And if parents are enacting this, if anything, the greater concern is with the child, because
Mm-hmm.
an adult can at least conceptualize that someone is being malicious. It will
Mm-hmm.
hurt, and they may well be suicidal, and they may well have all these difficulties, but they're processing it through an adult brain. So they can kind of in an adult way, conceptualize it and say, this person's being like this person's being like this. And yeah, you may be confused because this was someone you were once in love with and chose to procreate with. But if you think about, okay, take all of that and try and process it through a child's brain that has not yet fully formed, doesn't have the reasoning capabilities, hypersensitive in terms of emotional processing, because that part of the brain is maturing quicker, doesn't have the cognitive ability, doesn't have the attachment, you just, it's abuse, it's child abuse.
Oh, 100%. And it impacts everything when you're a child, your own
Yeah,
your beliefs about yourself and the world. And
yeah.
it's
Because and that's what I talk about more than anything is it's, if someone came along to you as an adult and said, "Oh, all those people that you trust in your life, they're actually out to kill you," as if you're in some kind of horror movie like The Purge or something, and it's like, okay, actually, a Bella's gone, and it means everyone's out to get you. Now, people would, well, for a movie idea, they think that was a bit far-fetched and absurd.
yeah.
And at least if you're an adult, you'd be able to maybe kind of try and process that. That's essentially what you're doing to a child. And you're doing it so effectively because they are still understanding who keeps them safe and what the world is like. They're still building their world. And you're telling me halfway through that construction, you're going to come in and say, oh, that person that you thought was safe, they're not safe at all. And in fact, they might actually be actively trying to harm you. I mean, that is really, really messed up thing to do. And you have to have a pretty good reason to do that. And there are some cases where people do have a good reason to do that because that person is out to harm the child. And that's the other thing I make clear in the book. I've never ever stood on any platform and said that there aren't parents out there that shouldn't be part of their children's lives because of the harm they cause. Because as a domestic violence researcher, of course I know that. However, there are so many other parents that are just good enough parents, and because of the malicious intent of the other parent, are being kept from their children to the great detriment of children.
Absolutely. Um, I wanted to ask one question about, I have two questions left pretty much. And then I
No
could,
worries.
yeah. So the first thing is, I've, I'm curious to hear about your experience with fatherhood.
I mean, in a statement that will surprise no one, I mean, I love my kids more than anything in the world. And I had that feeling, where, and I have that feeling now, if someone comes up to me and say, right, in order for your kids to live, you have to jump in front of a train. You'd be like, yeah, sure. See you later. Um, but that is very triggering. And I found both of my children's births and first few months very triggering because, and the main thing I boiled it down to with my therapist was I had that feeling of unconditional love. And all that did was make me question why I don't feel like I have that in the
Mm,
world for me. So it was kind of a question that then got asked up because of the love that I felt downwards. So that was the main thing. And I think just feeling really overwhelmed because I didn't feel like I had a schema to map myself onto in terms of what a parent looks like
yes,
and
yes.
how you're meant to love kids. I don't how do you love kids?
Yeah.
And I've started to maybe work it out a bit and you love them by showing up and you love them by supporting them and letting them, but I didn't really have in the way that I view potentially my wife did a blueprint
Right.
because all of my attachment systems have been so disrupted for all three of my what I would call primary caregivers. So my mum, my dad, and my stepmom, they've all had their own challenge and trauma.
Mm,
There's not been that kind of stable blueprint of sensitive responding that I now can enact. A lot of it was just holding this blob, being like, "Oh my, like, what do I do here?" And then spiraling because I feel guilty that I don't instinctively know what to
yes.
do or say or feel. And I'm a terrible, sorry, I almost swore then, but I'm a terrible dad. And and I'm not, and I shouldn't be here. Someone else should be doing this that's better. And my wife deserves better. And I don't deserve her. And they don't deserve me. And, other things that are a trigger for that attachment trauma because kids say stuff sometimes and they don't mean it.
Yeah.
Like my son has said, so my kids are 6 and 2 now. And my son has said before, I love mummy more than you. He doesn't know what he's saying, but I'm like, oh my God, I've never been more hurt in my entire life because you're triggering all of that abandonment,
Mhm.
rejection, etc. So yeah, I mean, plus all of the way that I think the low self-esteem and all these things, it makes parenting just more difficult generally, and I'm pretty sure I have ADHD, which I think is linked to early childhood trauma. So that makes things more difficult. So yeah, I just think, yeah, parenting's hard and everybody finds parenting hard.
I know. Yeah.
I find it really hard.
Hmm.
And I feel like I'm finding it less hard and I'm getting better, but that's because I've poured a tremendous amount of work into it, reading as much as I can, having the therapy, talking about these issues, but I'm already worried that I wasn't good enough in my son's first 3 years to give him what he needs to not become me and all this kind of stuff. So I think above all else, it makes you really paranoid. It
Yes.
makes
Oh
you a
my
paranoid
gosh.
parent because you're
That's
constantly thinking, am I doing the right thing? Am I,
yes.
and there are certain things that my wife and I are probably super vigilant about because of what I've been through. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, one of the things that we will never ever do, not even as a joke, is keep secrets from the other parent ever, because that is such a trigger for me in terms of parents turning against each other. And a lot of those can be innocuous, all like our little secret, like we're going to have a
Yeah.
sweet,
Yeah.
like, doesn't happen in our house
Mm.
because I'm so passionate about it. So it just affects you in little ways and big ways, I think.
everything you say is like what I've been going through the past year with
Yeah.
my kids.
Well, hopefully there's some solace in
Absolutely.
being like there's other people out there trying to parent when they were alienated as a child, and it's
Yeah.
difficult. It's
And
really difficult.
there's the process too of reparenting yourself while you're parenting your
Oh my
child.
goodness.
Yeah.
Yes. Honey, yes. So yes, yes. And so much of, I'll give you a prime example. So um there was a time when I was picking my son up from one of his clubs,
Mm,
and he was expecting my wife to go and pick him up.
mm,
And I said, "Oh, I'll go and get him." So I turned up. And, in my son's mind, that was just it processing in his little mind. He was like, "Oh, this is an unexpected thing that's happened. No implication for the love he feels for either of us or whatever." So when I came in, he had a really grumpy face, and he came up and he kind of bopped me on the arm as if to be like, "Oh, why are you here?" I was so hurt
mm,
and also furious. So two really big, powerful emotions.
mm,
And I didn't talk to him. So I got him in the car. I didn't talk to him the whole way home. Look, I mean, we don't really talk much in the car anyway. We're quite happy in each other's silence. But he, even when he was saying things, I just wasn't talking to him, which is out of order and a horrible thing to do to a child. But I was so deeply triggered. He was being driven home by a 6-year-old himself. That's what I felt. It was 6-year-old me driving in an adult's body,
yeah.
because all I felt was as a child would feel, but about being rejected. And I came in, face like thunder. He went in and started having his dinner. And my wife went, "What on earth is wrong?" And I went, "Ask him." Not an appropriate parental response, not an appropriate adult response. And that is because I was in my child mode. And a lot of the learning that I've done is about trying to understand when I'm in child mode and then how
Mm,
to deal with child mode. And
mm,
so, so one of the things I've learned is, for example, when I feel that way, I now visualize and bring and separate out the child and
mm.
then deal with them as a separate entity, thus maintaining myself as the adult. And it's little techniques like that. And I mean, it sounds absolutely crazy, but it helps because I kind of deal with my own child
Mhm,
inside me before I deal with the child in front of me that I am essentially in charge of and have to care for.
mhm.
Um, and it's a work in progress because I'm not
Yeah,
I'm
it
not very
doesn't
good at
sound
it.
crazy to me, actually. I think I'm gonna try doing that.
Yeah. And I pass it on to other people. Sometimes you just need to acknowledge and be like, "You're feeling this way and it's okay." It's amazing the healing that speaking to your inner child will bring,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
saying to them, "You're safe, you're loved." And then and then I do a lot of what I call recentering in my adult body. So taking the time to breathe,
yeah,
remember that I am 34, I am a dad, I'm here, and I am responsible for other people. And just bringing myself back out of and going, "Okay, I can deal with this now." So, but it's a work in progress, and I have to do it quite often. So, yeah, it's there's lots of effects, I think,
yeah.
lingering.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I know that it's not always easy to share personal things, but I think a lot of people, alien child survivors, will find that useful because,
I
um,
hope so.
yeah. Um, Lastly, I just wanted to talk about my favorite part of the book, which was the
Mm.
end. um, I let's see. It's when you address other children
Mm.
who've been through it, two alienated children, and you
Hmm.
say, I want to know that you are deserving of love, care, and support from both of your parents. It is never too late to rebuild and strengthen your relationships with your parents and other family members. And then you say, I love this part. This is so awesome. You said, remember that you have the power to forge your path and make choices that promote your well being and emotional health. And, I think that the first step to that seems to be you need to learn the truth. But
Hmm.
once you do, you can kind of take back your power, build your most wonderful life. That's what I've been
Hmm.
on a mission to do and to end the generational trauma, if it is
Yeah.
a generational pattern, which it is in my case, and it sounds like it is in your case too.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
and that's something I'm also the paranoia we were talking about. Like I have an irrational fear of repeating the past on my
Yeah.
kids, like
Yeah. Yeah.
irrational fear. So,
And
but
to the point almost where I found it. it's almost swung too far the other way. And in trying to do,
Yes.
I almost do too, and I know I already do too much because I'm the parent who is the parent governor, the scout leader, the school volunteer, because I think I'm trying to overcompensate.
Yeah.
Um, and I find it hard not to like buy them loads of stuff, that kind of thing. So it is a juggling act for sure, because you don't want
It
to go
is.
too far the other way. But yeah,
I've definitely done that too. Swung too far the other way. I'm just trying to
yeah,
come to the middle ground, but it's
yeah,
hard. It's hard, and it comes from good intentions. But
yeah, absolutely.
while reading, so my last question is, while reading that last little part, which was lovely, I was thinking about the concept of post-traumatic growth
Yes.
and the importance of resilience. I think it
Yeah.
will, you either have to be a resilient person to get through this or you won't get through it, in my opinion.
Mm.
So, what do you think are the three most important factors, in your honest opinion, for child survivors to be able to move forward most effectively, forge their own paths, take back their power, and achieve well-being,
Mm.
health, and healing?
I love that question. And I'm actually not going to say about truth and learning and necessarily having to reconnect. And the really only reason I'm not going to use that as one of my three is because some people don't have the opportunity.
Mm.
If they don't know where that parent is, or if that parent has passed before they have a chance to do that. So I wouldn't want to peg one of my three to that and make people feel like they can't move on, because everybody has the chance to move on. I would say the first thing is formal support. I don't recommend that anybody does this without a trained professional supporting them through any kind of process they want to embark upon, even just talking about their experiences growing up, or if they think they've been alienated. I think you have to have, there's a reason people are trained to do this, because you need someone to guide you on that journey. It's not something you can, I don't feel it's not something you can do purely by yourself. Um, and I think my second thing, and this really just shows how important support is informal support. I
Mm.
think it's about having people around you that you can then talk about outside a therapeutic area, because there are also times when you need to talk in a non-therapeutic way and vent and say things and say this and say that. So I think having that informal support is really, really important as well. I'm just thinking about my third thing. So this is things that are necessary in order for growth.
Or the most effective things you've found so far?
Most effective things. Um, you have to buy in to a core philosophy. And the core philosophy is that you are worthy
Mm.
of doing this for yourself,
Wow.
that you can do this for yourself, because both of those fundamental beliefs about worth and efficacy are challenged through the process of alienation. And I think that is the most effective thing, is reclaiming those two things. It's very difficult, it's not easy, but that's what's necessary in order to be able to forge a new path. And you are not beholden to your past. And this is one of the biggest transformations that I've been through, is around my viewing my scars as things that have made me stronger,
Mm.
rather than balls around my ankles that will hold me back. Because one of the most transformative set of sessions that I've had is where I've been talking about, in such negative language, this happened and it made me like this happened and it made me like this, and they're all negative. And it was just through the prompt of someone saying, well, can I just challenge that and say, what do you think this has enabled you to do better?
Mm.
And actually, I was sat in sessions going, well, I'm pretty good in emergency. I'm pretty good at dealing under pressure. And that came from that time, and I'm a very, I'm really sensitive to other people's feelings. That came from that time. So I think it's about building a new version of yourself that focuses on the strength that you draw from adversity rather than the negative. But yeah, I would say formal support, informal support, and an adoption of two core beliefs of worth and efficacy and ability, is what I would say. But
Amazing.
I would love the opportunity to obviously speak with people directly in the planned kind of follow up. And if people want to ask their own questions about that and in their own situation, then because I think sometimes it is hard to put a catch all, because even those, I mean, not everybody can pay for formal support, that kind of thing. So I
Yeah.
think above anything else, it's about finding what works best for you to journey on. And people are at different points in that journey as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your insight and expertise and for
My pleasure.
dedicating your life's work to helping
Yeah,
people understand this. And it means so much to me and it means so much to other people watching. And I'm really excited for people to be able to ask you questions too about your
me
book.
too. Me too.
But it was just great to have this conversation with you. So I really appreciate it.
No, well, you're welcome, and I'm really looking forward to working, together in the future. And yeah, like you said, the work is ongoing, and it's a big task that we've got ahead. So let's do it.
Thanks, Ben.